you're watching Classic Ed, and in this video I'm going to talk about the maintenance and repair costs on the P38. Now, I've had the P38 for about 3 years now, just under, and put about 15,000 miles on it. And I have to say, it's been one of the most pleasant surprises in my automotive history. However, I've recently decided that I have too many cars, and because the P38 is in by far the best condition of any of them, and by far the most saleable, it's the one that unfortunately has got to go. So I'm going to do a series of videos, maybe like 2 or 3, just offering some reflections on the model for anyone who may be interested in purchasing one. And in this one I'm going to focus on the invoices and tell you what it has actually cost us to have this car for nearly 3 years. Now, I'm going to say at the outset that I've done this the expensive way, so to speak. The P38, although I do bits and pieces on it, is primarily a garage maintained car, and I take it to a reputable specialist who is quite expensive, and I generally operate on a kind of no expense spared, fix everything basis, with 1 or 2 exceptions that I'll go on to in a minute. If you had one, if you bought a reasonable one and did it on a more DIY basis, or if you found, and they do exist, they're quite difficult to find, but they do exist, a smaller specialist who nonetheless knows the cars well, but probably has a cheaper rate than, you know, one of the big specialists or main dealers, then you could substantially reduce your costs. So what I'm about to explain is very much the expensive route, but I think it does underline the reality of these cars, is that they are now potentially more than 25 years old. Because they're not worth a huge amount of money, they tend to be a bit neglected, and even if you buy a good one and spend good money on getting a good one, you are bound to have some big bills in the first few months of ownership. So anyway, here we go. First thing that happened with this car about a month into our ownership of it, the crank sensor failed, which is a very common thing on these cars, and to be honest, if I'd known what I know now about them, I would have done this job myself, because the symptoms are so distinctive, and it's such an easy thing to change the crank sensor. Essentially what happens is the car, when it starts to fail, it fails when it's hot. So the car will start okay when it's completely cold, but typically after about 10 minutes of running, when it comes up to temperature, it'll cut out, and then initially it won't start again. Then after about maybe half an hour, it will start with difficulty, and then it'll go back to normal starting once it's cooled down completely. It's to do with the way that the sensor fails. To be honest, it's something that all the later EFI Rover V8 suffer from, and I would say actually if you get one of these and you don't know the history, the status of the crank sensor, just replace it. £90 for a genuine one, considerably less for an aftermarket one, and it's just a cheap piece of insurance as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, I did have it recovered at the time because I didn't have, work was busy, I didn't have the time to sort of troubleshoot it myself. I'd only just, you know, we only had the car for a month, so I was still relatively ignorant of these things. So I took it to Keith Gott in Alton, in Hampshire, who are the people who I've done, you know, done most of the work on the car, and to diagnose, replace, etc. That cost £268. This is in, so that was in January 2020, so we'd had the car for about a month then, and then in April 2020 went in for its first major service with them, an MOT. And what did they do? So they did the service and MOT, which obviously are oil and filter change and pollen filter change, that sort of thing. They also replaced deteriorated auxiliary drive belt, replaced missing airflow filter to airbox seal, leaking throttle body heater and refitted hoses. Yeah, so the P38 has a coolant channel in the throttle body, which quite often people bypass because the original pipework leaks. What had happened in this car, someone had bypassed it, but then the bypass pipework had also started leaking, so they put it back to the factory standard. They replaced some warped front brake discs. Seems to be quite a common thing on these cars. This happened to me again actually about a year later. The brake discs on the front just warped randomly. I never quite got to the bottom of why. Something that I've started to do after the second time they warped was not sitting with the foot brake applied for long periods of time, because I think that was maybe heat warping the front discs a bit. So I would either put the car in park, even at like the lights and stuff, or I would just let the car, I would stop a bit before the lights and then let the car creep forward periodically while they were still red, just so that the pads weren't always clamping the same spot on the discs. Replace worn near side front anti-roll bar drop links, front suspension radius arms. So yeah, when I got the car, it was driving like rubbish, and most P38s, unless they have had all the bushes done, drive like rubbish, which is most P38s that are for sale, I suspect. And this one actually probably drove the best of any one I'd driven. Like, it wasn't as bad as some, but the drop links, the anti-roll bar bushes, the radius arm bushes, like, they all need doing on these cars, because otherwise they just, this is why people say that the P38 wallows and wanders all over the place, because the suspension bushes are all shot and people don't replace them. But anyway, the difference is like night and day, I must say. Fitted customer supplied seatbelt buckle. Yeah, one of the rear seatbelt buckle casings had snapped off, so I got a replacement second-hand one off eBay. Yeah, so that first bill with all that came to £1,157. And then in December 2020, so we're about a year into ownership now, I built up over the first year a bit of a laundry list of items, and I took it back into Keith Scott in December 2020 to sort of reach the point where I wanted to just offload a load of jobs to them, and to do a bit of diagnosis on general commentary on the condition of the car, how it was driving, a few drivetrain knocks and noises, a bit of a shift issue with the gearbox. It was doing a bit of a weird shift from third up to fourth. So they replaced front worn wheel bearings, because that was probably causing a bit of a driving vibration, and also a noise, you could hear them. They replaced the front prop shaft UJ. They replaced the gearbox oil and changed the filter. They also replaced the front heated seat elements, because this is something this is the only P38 I've ever been in where the heated seats actually work, because the elements don't last very long, to be honest. It's a rubbish design. They weren't that great when they were new. They were never that hot when they were new. You can make them hotter actually if you change like one of the resistors or something in the system. I didn't have them do that, but I did just get them to change the elements. But even that was like £500 worth of labour. They also tested the heating elements in the front and rear screens, did a few other minor bits and pieces. Somehow that bill ended up coming to £2,558, and this is what happens when you give a garage a laundry list. They then phone you up saying, oh, we've also found X, Y and Z. You end up saying, yeah, just do it, and that's how you end up with a £200 bill. But anyway, then I had the rear brake discs and pads done locally. That was £200. That was just done by my local tyre place, actually, Mitchell Leather Tyres. They're very good, actually, and it was just something that I hadn't gotten around to at the last MOT. That's £200. We're now back round to March 2021, so kind of at the second service MOT point here. What did they do? They did the service, MOT, replaced front wiper blades. The brake discs had warped again somehow. Replaced the heater intake foam filter. Yeah, the number of P38s you see that don't have the foam in the scuttle filter the scuttle intake for the heater. I don't get it, because it's not a difficult job to do actually DIY. You just take the scuttle off and change the foam, and yeah, it's a bit of a hassle maybe, but much rather that than let a load of water through the scuttle. But you know, so many P38s are missing it. I don't know why. They also had to do the exhaust, because the exhaust when I got the car was in really poor condition from the cat's back, and it had just about scraped through MOT the first time. Second MOT it failed because of a massive hole in one of the tailpipes. And although I could have just gotten away with just replacing that pipe and it would have gotten through its MOT on that occasion, the general condition of the exhaust was poor, so I just ended up saying, you know, replace it with a complete stainless system. I went for a standard system. I didn't go for any of these, like, you know, chrome tail pipes that stick out from under the bumper. I think they look crap on these cars personally. So standard shape but stainless, so it just sounds a bit better and hopefully will last a bit longer. That was about 600, 700 pounds or something. Oh, they also replaced the rear air springs because they were showing signs of perishing, and since I do tow with this car a bit, you know, obviously the rear air springs are under quite a lot of pressure when you're towing, so I didn't want to take any chances in that regard. They also did the rear brake pipes were corroded, and although it was one of those things where, yes, it was scraping through that year, but next year I knew it was going to fail on them, so I had those. And again, laundry list time, £2,693. We then had a new alternator because that was being noisy as well a bit later in the year. That was 180. Tom Custy of Absolute Land Rovers, in June 21, he did a new radiator for me because basically the radiator was probably fine, but when he looked at the car for me, he'd noticed that, and I hadn't noticed this, but again, it's sort of a power of sort of specialist knowledge really. If you're looking at the radiator of the P38 standing in front of the car, there's a really small pipe that comes off pointing to the left, and that pipe had snapped off, and apparently this is quite a common thing to see, that because it's a really small little pipe. It's a plastic cased radiator, unfortunately, and they get brittle, they break, whatever. And although someone had quite successfully glued it back on, this did look like a bit of a time bomb because obviously cooling system's under a lot of pressure. It probably would eventually have ruptured. So given the fact that the radiator was a bit of an unknown as well, I just thought just change the radiator. So he did that, and that was £286.97. We were then, the next bill then, yeah, the car was quiet actually for the rest of 2021. I did a bit of work on the interior, fixed the sunroof, I fixed some leak in the roof right at the front where the roof panels joined together, did a few bits and pieces like that, but it didn't see the inside of a garage again, you know, for the second half of 2021. So then we came round to May of this year, so we're now back onto the 12,000 mile service on P38 MOT. I left the MOT a bit late this year actually. The car did sit out of MOT for a couple of weeks because I'd just been a bit disorganised and hadn't got it booked in time, and I couldn't take it to a local place as one of the ABS lights had come on, and I slightly regret this actually. I never got around to getting a proper diagnostic for this car, like a Nanocom or a Hawkeye. It is an OBD2 compliant car, but the port is OBD2 compliant, but it's not recent. It's one of those like funny 90s cars that still needs like a specialist diagnostic tool to actually properly read all the faults. You know, a generic tool won't read it. And the ABS light coming on was one of the few times I could have benefited from that, because it would have told me which sensor was at fault, because I cleaned all the sensors in the hope that would clear the fault, but it obviously logged a hard fault in the ABS ECU, so I was never going to be able to clear it without, you know, a diagnostic. So I couldn't just take it to a local place just to get its ticket before I could take it in for service a bit later. So it ended up sitting out of ticket for a little while. Anyway, I took it into Keithcott. They sorted the ABS, the traction control warning light. They also did the front suspension lower ball joints. They also did, what else did they do? A few other minor bits and pieces. And that came to £1,043. I then had the headlining done, which was £260, and I have to say it was one of the best £260 I've ever spent on this car, because I'd had a go during the first lockdown at doing the headlining myself, and I actually did a pretty good job, but it was a monumental faff, it really was. And what this guy does, it was done by a guy called Jason. His business is called Blackbrook Auto Trim. He's down in Taunton. It was a bit of a drive, but I made the drive because he came on good recommendation from someone else. And what he does, he pre-covers the boards before you arrive, and then when you arrive, he literally just whips your board out, puts the pre-covered one in, puts it all back together again, and away you go. Literally, I was done in like an hour. And he made it look so easy. Obviously he's been doing it for years, but like he made it look so easy. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, you know what, that was one DIY task that was a bit stupid to try and take on, because, you know, if I'd, you know, bearing in mind the value of my time, which is a certain amount, and just the general faffage factor, which is something that I've become increasingly conscious of as I've owned more and more old cars. 260 quid to do that was a bargain. Anyway, also needed two new tyres. I've always had this car on 18-inch wheels. I prefer how they drive on 18-inch wheels for road use, so I did that. Two 18-inch tyres. That was Goodyear Asymmetric 3, £136 each. So with the fitting, alignment, blah blah blah, that was £400 actually. Okay. And then final bill to get the aircon working was about £1,500 again from Keith Gott. So the aircon compressor towards the end of 21 had started making a really quite horrific noise, so I switched it off, and I didn't get around to having anyone look at it for quite a long time, nearly a year actually, which was a bit of a mistake really, because switching the aircon off for a long period of time tends to mean all the gas escapes. So when I finally took it to Keith Gott for them to do it, the dryer also needed replacing. The compressor, maybe they could have lubricated the compressor, I don't know. They ended up changing the compressor, and you know, it was probably the original unit, so that's not a bad thing. They didn't replace the condenser, because although they said it was a little bit deteriorated, it was still working and holding gas. So that was about £1,500, and we got the aircon working again. I have to say, the aircon on these cars is really good actually when it's working. Like, it comes on cold like instantly, and it's really powerful, so that's obviously nice. So there've obviously been quite a lot of other bits and pieces on the car that I've done myself, you know, whether it be door handles or fixing the sunroof or fixing the leak in the roof, or all sorts of other bits and pieces on the trim, little bit of paint here and there on the body. What did I do the other day? I did the spring in the tailgate release button, because that tends to stick and jam as a result. So the invoice total that you've just heard, that comes to about £9,700, and if I were to conservatively estimate the parts on top of that, that I've, you know, for the interior or whatever, you know, wood trims, did a new dash trim at the top, yeah, 11 grand, something like that. Now, a big chunk of that is labour. So the labour rate for Keith Gott, the garage who've done probably 90% of the work on the car, is, I think they're about £75 an hour. So obviously that's high. Smaller specialist who nonetheless knows the cars, maybe 50, something like that. You'd be very lucky in the south of England though to find a labour rate much lower than that. Obviously up north things are a bit cheaper labour wise, so you know, this reflects, you know, the south of England where there's a big demand for Land Rover specialists. You know. What I have found with the specialists though, and this is something that's struck me with a number of cars now, is that you do kind of get what you pay for. Yeah, there are some rip-off merchants out there. I wouldn't go anywhere near a main dealer with one of these cars, obviously, because I just don't really rate main dealers generally, certainly not with Land Rover anyway. But there've been a number of so-called specialists that I've been to who have a cheaper labour rate, but then you find out why. Either they take longer to do things because they don't know the cars as well, or they're actually cutting corners, and when this is inevitably revealed, you then get into an argument with them about, you know, whose fault it is and why it's happened. So I'd rather pay a higher labour rate and know that there's someone who is reputable I can trust and won't mess me around. Because there have been a few occasions actually with Keith Gott where maybe they haven't quite got things right, but they've always been open and honest with me about it, and it's always been resolved to my satisfaction, and they've never tried to dispute anything. They've always been really helpful, and so that is really, really worth something in my opinion. Now, I'll just mention a few things on this car that have not gone wrong, that can go wrong on P38s. So this car has not needed any major engine work. In fact, the engine has basically not been touched. It's the original engine. So it has about 137,000 miles on it. To my knowledge, it has never been apart. To my knowledge, it has never overheated. There's a bit of a leak certainly from the rocker cover gaskets, and probably also the valley gasket as well. There might be a bit of a leak coming from between the engine and the transmission, but so other than the fact that it leaks a bit, there's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't overheat, cools all day long. There probably is a bit of cam wear, just because it's almost impossible for a Rover V8 to get to that mileage without the cams being a bit worn. So there's a single cam in there because it's an overhead valve engine, and that cam is doing an awful lot of work. Now, the flip side of that, the benefit of that, is that unlike your more advanced German like Mercedes and BMW twin cam V8s or overhead cam V8s, the timing chain on the Rover V8 can generally be left alone. It's a very simple thing. It doesn't snap like the German ones do. Even the fairly recent like BMW V8s, the number of times you hear about them eating their chain guides and things like that, and that's just something that, yeah, I'm sure a chain has snapped on a Rover V8, but it's not something that the Rover V8 typically does. Because this one has reached that mileage without any work, I'm fairly certain it's never going to experience any of these sort of block issues, block cracking, liners slipping, that sort of thing. That tended to be something that manifested itself a bit earlier in the engine's life and was more associated with poor quality production casting. So the engine's not going to do anything weird like that, I don't think. What will happen though eventually is that the head gasket will need doing. So if I were keeping this car, I would expect the head gasket to be done somewhere between 150 and 200k, because the head gasket on most British engines of the era just doesn't last forever, and obviously if it goes on one of these cars while you're driving, there is a bit of a risk that you overheat it and damage the engine. I'd say if you turn it off immediately, you're not going to damage anything. Maybe the heads will warp a little bit, but they can obviously be re-skimmed within reason. Block damage is not going to occur you have to be really let it run hot for a long time for that to happen. And so I would probably expect about a £2,000 bill from that. Now, what I would probably have done again is to use the opportunity to also get the top end of the engine just refreshed generally. So new cam, get all the valves done, do whatever needed doing to the heads, just like refurbish them so that they were all nicely in tune and back to kind of factory spec, because the block itself probably is not going to wear that much if it's reached this stage in its life without failing. But the heads, all the stuff that's going on in the heads does wear out, and a good top end refresh would have really, it would have made the car really good again from a power and torque point of view. Not that it's bad at the moment, but it would have improved it, and maybe upgrade the cam or something like that. Over and above the head gasket job, add a few grand on top. Obviously once you get into a major engine work, you are talking, multiples of thousands of pounds potentially. But let's say I had a budget of £5,000, something like that. I don't think that would be bad money for, considering how much life it puts on the car. So that's something that, to bear in mind with your high mileage Rover V8. That's actually, on the subject of V8, that is actually a good example of why I wouldn't necessarily get a really low mileage P38. Just going back to what I was saying about the block, if you've got a high mileage original block, it's probably okay. It's not going to start leaking from inside the cylinder walls or anything weird like that. Most of the bad Rover V8 blocks have probably died a long time ago, but there could still be one or two out there in sort of some very low mileage garage queens that are still kind of time bombs waiting to go off. You just don't know, but there's one instance where I would actually maybe err on the side of higher mileage because it's more of a known quantity. The other thing that hasn't really gone wrong on this car is the air suspension. There's been a few times when the compressor has become a bit noisy. It seems to come and go. If I'm honest, it's not something that's ever really worried me about much, but other than having the rear air springs replaced, suspension has always behaved perfectly, and that's with towing. And I don't really off-road, but you know, I don't hang about. You know, the car gets used most days, and you know, I don't mollycoddle it. The suspension's just always just worked. I think a lot of these horror stories you hear about the suspension are because either it's been mucked about with by someone who didn't know what they were doing, or someone's taken it to someone who doesn't understand it and they just start throwing parts at it. You really have to either know what you're doing, which I'll admit I'm not, you know, I would not really do work on the ES on this car because it is a complex thing. You know, you've got to know what you're doing, or you've got to take it to someone who does, because you've got to, you know, you've got to know how to calibrate the ride height sensors properly. Checking for leaks is not difficult, but for example, if you wanted to rebuild the valve block in the compressor compartment, or rebuild the compressor or thing like that, you know, it's a fairly specialized jobs that are DIYable, but you would have to really put the effort in to educate yourself about how to do them, and I think a lot of people don't. And then the other thing is electrical gremlins. I've not really had any electrical gremlins in this car, and again, that's something that supposedly P38s are notorious for. Having heard so many stories about Land Rovers of the period, not just the P38, but the Discovery as well, from the sort of, you know, mid to late 90s, noughties, that sort of thing, I've kind of come to the conclusion that you either get a car that gives you a lot of electrical trouble, or you don't. And this one is very much been in the latter category, and I don't know why that is. I don't know if maybe they're just production standards on the loom. Maybe sometimes a car gets given a, you know, a Friday afternoon loom, so to speak, and it just not put together properly. I don't know. But in terms of the P38 specifically, I've noticed that there are three basic things that seem to cause issues. So one of them is actually just not having a good enough battery. So when I first got this one, the battery in it was obviously wrong. It was too small, and also the terminals were the wrong way round for the car. So the battery wouldn't even sit flat in the compartment, because it would have to be sort of, you know, tilted back against the back of the battery compartment to get the cables for the positive and negative to actually reach the terminals, and that's because the terminals are the wrong way round. You have to get one with the terminals the right way round so that it matches up with the positive and negative leads. It was also just too small. So I got like 1,000 cold crank Hankook battery, which is like one of the best batteries you can get for these, and I never get any battery drain. You can leave the car for like 2 weeks. Okay, I say I never get any battery drain, that's an exaggeration, but like, you know, you can leave the car for like 2 weeks and it'll still start up fine when you come back. Putting a decent battery in will make a lot of these kind of lower grade electrical gremlins just go away. So that's an obvious thing. The fuse box can also be a bit of a trouble, kind of a hot spot, bottleneck, because the fuse boxes do get quite hot where they are under the engine bay, and relays they sometimes burn out with age. And if you're looking at one, if you look inside the fuse box and just see scorched marks underneath the relays, for example, you know, just change the whole box, because that's actually a known cause of fire in the P38 as well, like dodgy electrical connections in the fuse box, because over time the little bits of solder and stuff can melt. Relays get overheated, and everything just starts playing havoc. So again, that can be something that just changing the box and all the relays can suddenly make, you know, all these issues go away. And then finally, obviously the body control module can go wrong in these cars. It's actually not as common as you might think from having read all the horror stories, but they can go wrong like anything, you know, electronic, you know, that's old. And you know, this is the problem with 90s electronics. In its old age, it does, you know, it can misbehave quite badly. What I would say about the BCM though is that if you think that the BCM is acting up, and a symptom of that might be that you get lots of seemingly simultaneous but unrelated electrical gremlins, so like the locking might start being weird at the same time as the lights come on at the wrong time, that sort of thing, then take it to someone who can really diagnose it. There are people out there who actually keep BCMs for diagnostic purpose, so they have like a known good one that they can put on your car, and that will then tell you whether you've got a BCM issue or not. If you just take it to someone who doesn't really know what they're looking at, then it's a recipe for, you know, parts darts and tail chasing, and no one's happy. So again, I think that underlines a general message actually with these cars. If you take it to the right person or know what you're doing, they're not actually as bad as some of the stories might suggest. So anyway, that's it really. All I can say for now is that despite that, 9.5k bill that I've racked up over the last 3 years, I don't regret a moment of it. You always end up spending lots of money on old cars, and it's been a pleasure to own the P38. It's a good car, the last of the great chassis Land Rovers with the Rover V8. But all the sort of flaws that made it dated and idiosyncratic when it was new add to its charm now, 25 years old, 25 years on. So, it's a very rewarding, older, I hesitate to use the word classic, but older SUV to own.